You used your knowledge of the law to plan and commit these murders. For the 4 counts of first-degree murder of your husband and children, this court sentences you to death. This is the greatest betrayal of trust this court has ever witnessed.
62-year-old Emma Peterson, a former judge, murdered her husband William and their 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Thomas, by poisoning their drinks with a lethal dose of her prescription medication. The family had gathered at the Peterson family home for what appeared to be a celebratory dinner with no indication of the tragedy that would unfold before the night was over. Neighbors would later report seeing the family arriving throughout the early evening, cars lining the circular driveway of the stately colonial home that had been the Peterson family residence for over 20 years. What began as a seemingly normal family gathering ended with 4 bodies discovered the following morning when Emma Peterson herself called 911, her voice eerily calm as she reported finding her family unresponsive. Before we dive deeper into this shocking case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. The Peterson home sat on 3 acres in Baltimore's exclusive Guilford neighborhood, a historic district known for its grand mansions and tree-lined streets that showcase the stark contrast between Baltimore's wealthy enclaves and the struggling neighborhoods just miles away. From the outside, the brick Georgian-style home, with its manicured gardens and wrought-iron gates, projected an image of success and stability that the Peterson family had cultivated for decades within Baltimore's elite social circles. Emma Peterson had served as a circuit court judge for over 20 years before her retirement 2 years prior, building a reputation for harsh sentencing and a no-nonsense approach in her courtroom that earned her both admirers and critics within the Maryland legal community. Her husband, William, was a prominent cardiologist affiliated with Johns Hopkins Hospital, while their 3 adult children had all established themselves in respectable professions, Michael as an investment banker, Sarah as a pediatrician, and Thomas as an architect. The evening of September 11th had been planned as a family dinner to celebrate William's recent appointment as chief of cardiology, an achievement that represented the pinnacle of his medical career at age 64. Emma had spent the day preparing what would be their last meal, moving methodically through the spacious chef's kitchen with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances that she had insisted on during their last home renovation. Investigators would later reconstruct that she had prepared William's favorite meal, beef Wellington with roasted vegetables, and a chocolate souffle for dessert, a labor-intensive menu that required precise timing and attention to detail. The elaborate meal choice would later be seen by prosecutors as evidence of premeditation, a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to gather her family together one last time while providing ample opportunity to administer the lethal doses without arousing suspicion. As darkness fell over Baltimore that September evening, the Peterson family gathered around the mahogany dining table that had been in William's family for generations, crystal glasses filled with an expensive Cabernet that Emma had selected from their climate-controlled wine cellar. The conversation likely flowed easily among family members who saw each other regularly but were now adults with their own lives, sharing updates about careers and relationships while Emma moved between the dining room and kitchen, bringing out courses and refilling drinks with what neighbors would later describe as her unfailing hostess perfection. What none of the victims knew was that Emma had been methodically adding increasing doses of her prescription sleeping medication to their drinks throughout the evening, calculating the timing so they would begin feeling the effects after returning to their respective homes or guest rooms. The Peterson family's final dinner together concluded around 10:30 p.m., with Michael and Sarah leaving for their own homes, while Thomas, who lived in Washington, D.C., retired to the guest room he always used when visiting his parents. The following morning, Emma Peterson called 911 at precisely 7:43 a.m., reporting that she had found her husband unresponsive in their bed and her son Thomas unresponsive in the guest room. Her voice on the recorded call was described by the emergency dispatcher as unnaturally calm, with Emma explaining that she had already checked for pulses and found none. Baltimore first responders arrived at 7:52 a.m. to find William Peterson in the master bedroom and Thomas Peterson in a guest room, both deceased with no immediate signs of trauma or disturbance. Within 30 minutes, as police began their initial investigation of the scene, Emma received calls from neighbors of both Michael and Sarah, who had been found unresponsive in their own homes when colleagues checked on them after they failed to appear for work commitments. The calls confirming all 4 deaths came within a 90-minute window, creating what initially appeared to be a baffling medical mystery that spanned 3 separate locations in the Baltimore area. The Baltimore Police Department quickly established a connection between the 4 deaths, notifying the medical examiner's office of the unusual cluster of fatalities within a single family. Emma Peterson maintained a composed demeanor throughout the initial investigation, attributing the deaths to a possible genetic heart condition that had gone undiagnosed despite her husband's medical expertise. Baltimore's port area swarmed with morning activity as ships unloaded cargo and dock workers began their day, completely unaware that one of the city's most prominent families had been decimated overnight in what would eventually be revealed as a calculated act of familicide. The contrast between the industrial grit of Baltimore's harbor and the refined luxury of the Peterson home created a backdrop of societal division that would become a subtle theme throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, highlighting the different versions of Baltimore that existed side by side in a city known for its stark economic disparity. As the bodies were transported to the medical examiner's office in downtown Baltimore, Emma Peterson began making funeral arrangements with the same efficiency and attention to detail that had characterized her judicial career. She contacted Waterman's Funeral Home, the same establishment that had handled her parents' services years earlier, and selected 4 matching mahogany caskets with custom brass fittings that cost over $12,000 each. The immediacy and precision of her funeral planning would later be noted by investigators as unusual, particularly her insistence on cremation rather than burial, a decision that contradicted the Catholic traditions that William had always observed. Within hours of the bodies being discovered, Emma Peterson had already contacted her husband's estate attorney to inquire about the execution of his will and the insurance policies he maintained on himself and their children, conversations that were meticulously documented and would eventually become evidence of her premeditation. Baltimore's medical examiner, Dr. Lydia Reeves, personally supervised the autopsies of all 4 Peterson family members, prioritizing the cases due to the unusual nature of 4 related deaths occurring simultaneously across multiple locations. The Peterson home was processed as a potential crime scene, with technicians collecting glasses, bottles, and food remains from the previous night's dinner, while detectives interviewed neighbors about any unusual activity they might have observed. The initial working theory among investigators focused on possible food poisoning or carbon monoxide exposure, with teams checking the home's ventilation systems and appliances for malfunctions that might explain the mysterious deaths. Emma Peterson remained at the family home during this process, calmly directing investigators to various rooms and answering questions with the precise, measured responses of someone accustomed to legal proceedings, never once displaying the emotional devastation one would expect from a woman who had lost her entire family overnight. William Peterson was more than just a renowned cardiologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was a pioneer in minimally invasive cardiac procedures who had saved countless lives throughout his 4-decade medical career. His colleagues described him as brilliant yet humble, a doctor who remembered the names of every nurse and janitor in his department and who still made time to personally call patients after their procedures to check on their recovery. William had grown up in modest circumstances in West Baltimore, the son of a postal worker and a seamstress who had sacrificed to put him through medical school, giving him a perspective on Baltimore's economic disparities that informed his extensive pro bono work in underserved communities throughout the city. His patients came from all walks of life, from the dock workers along Baltimore's industrial harbor to the wealthy executives in the city's financial district, all receiving the same attentive care from a doctor who viewed his work as a calling rather than merely a prestigious career. William's death at 64 came just as he was preparing to implement a new community outreach program that would bring advanced cardiac screening technologies to Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods, a project he had spent years developing and had finally secured funding for just weeks before his murder. Michael Peterson, the eldest of the three Peterson children at 38, had followed a different path than his father, using his Stanford MBA to build a successful career in investment banking that had recently earned him a partnership at one of Baltimore's most prestigious financial firms. Unlike the stereotype of the cutthroat financier, Michael had developed a reputation for ethical investment practices and had pioneered several community development funds that channeled capital into Baltimore's struggling neighborhoods to support small business growth and affordable housing initiatives. His wife Jessica and their twin 7-year-old daughters were visiting Jessica's parents in Boston on the night of the murder, a coincidence that spared them from also being victims and left them to grapple with an incomprehensible loss. Friends described Michael as a devoted father who coached his daughter's soccer team despite his demanding work schedule and who had recently begun teaching financial literacy classes at his former high school in an effort to create more economic opportunities for Baltimore's youth. Michael's death created a void not only in his immediate family but in the numerous Baltimore community organizations where he had served as a board member and fundraiser, organizations that had relied on his financial expertise and generous personal contributions to sustain their programs. Sarah Peterson, 35, had followed in her father's medical footsteps but chosen pediatrics as her specialty, working at the University of Maryland Children's Hospital, where she had developed an innovative program for treating childhood asthma that was particularly prevalent in Baltimore's industrial areas. Her warm personality and genuine connection with young patients had earned her the nickname Dr. Sunshine among the hospital staff, who noted that she often wore colorful scrubs adorned with cartoon characters and kept a drawer full of small toys in her office to reward brave patients after difficult procedures. Sarah had recently become engaged to fellow physician Robert Chen, with their wedding planned for the following spring, and dreams of eventually opening a pediatric clinic together in one of Baltimore's medically underserved neighborhoods. Her death left hundreds of patients without their trusted doctor and devastated the hospital staff who had come to see her as both a gifted physician and a natural leader who elevated the spirits of everyone around her. The engagement ring she had proudly shown off to her family at their final dinner together was still on her finger when her body was discovered, a detail that particularly haunted her fiancé as he struggled to comprehend how their future had been so suddenly and brutally erased. Thomas Peterson, at 32, the youngest of the siblings, had established himself as a rising star in the architectural world, specializing in sustainable urban design with a particular focus on revitalizing historic buildings in cities like Baltimore that had strong industrial pasts. After completing his master's degree at MIT, Thomas had surprised everyone by turning down offers from prestigious New York and Chicago firms to return to Baltimore, where he had founded a small practice dedicated to projects that balanced architectural preservation with environmental innovation and community needs. He had recently won a major commission to redesign a former manufacturing complex in East Baltimore into a mixed-use development that would include affordable housing, workspace for artists, and a community health center, a project that embodied his belief that architecture should serve social good rather than merely aesthetic or commercial interests. Thomas identified as gay and had been in a committed relationship with James Wilson, a civil rights attorney for the past 5 years, with plans to marry once Thomas's major project was completed. His death not only robbed Baltimore of an architectural talent committed to the city's revitalization, but also left James to navigate a profound grief compounded by the shock of losing his future husband to such an unthinkable act of familicide. Together, the Peterson family represented a particular vision of success and civic commitment that had earned them respect throughout Baltimore's diverse communities, from the wealthy neighborhoods around the Inner Harbor to the working-class areas that still reflected the city's industrial heritage. William and Emma's marriage had been widely viewed as a partnership of equals, with his medical prominence balanced by her judicial authority, creating a power couple that was frequently featured in Baltimore Magazine's annual lists of influential citizens. Their 3 children had grown up in the privileged environment of private schools and summer homes, but had been raised with a strong emphasis on public service and responsibility to the wider community, values that each had carried into their adult lives and professional choices. The annual Peterson Family Foundation Gala was one of the highlights of Baltimore's social calendar, raising millions for educational scholarships for promising students from the city's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, a tradition that William had insisted on establishing after his own experience of educational support lifting him out of poverty. From the outside, the Peterson family appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream, successful, generous, and unified, despite the busy professional lives that could have easily pulled them in different directions. Their spacious home in Baltimore's Guilford neighborhood frequently hosted gatherings that brought together an eclectic mix of the city's elite and community leaders from all backgrounds, with Emma and William known for their ability to connect people across Baltimore's often rigid social and economic divides. The family's regular Sunday dinners were a tradition that all 3 adult children prioritized despite their busy schedules, maintaining the close connections that made them appear to be the ideal family to friends, colleagues, and the broader Baltimore community. The shock of their deaths reverberated throughout Baltimore's interconnected social circles, from the courthouse where Emma had presided to the hospital corridors where William and Sarah had treated patients, creating a collective grief that transcended the city's usual boundaries of class, race, and neighborhood. What no one outside the family knew, and what the investigation would later reveal, was that beneath this perfect exterior lay a complex web of resentment, deception, and secret plans that had been building within Emma Peterson for years. The contrast between the family's public image and the dark reality of Emma's growing dissatisfaction created a psychological dissonance that ultimately exploded into violence, transforming a respected judge into a calculated killer who could methodically plan and execute the murder of her entire family. As investigators would soon discover, Emma Peterson had mastered the art of compartmentalization, maintaining her public persona as a devoted wife, mother, and community leader, while privately nurturing a growing desire to escape the life she had built and the family she had come to view not as beloved individuals, but as obstacles to her freedom and future happiness. The victims of Emma Peterson's crimes were not random targets, but the people who knew her best and trusted her most, making her betrayal all the more profound and incomprehensible to the Baltimore community that had admired the Peterson family for decades. The 911 call placed by Emma Peterson at 7:43 a.m. on September 12, 2020, was routed to Baltimore City Emergency Services dispatcher Keisha Williams, who would later testify about the unnerving calm in Emma's voice as she reported finding her husband and son unresponsive. The audio recording of the call, which would eventually be played for the jury, captured Emma stating with clinical precision, "This is Judge Emma Peterson at 4712 Greenway in Guilford. My husband William and my son Thomas appear to be deceased in their beds. There are no signs of trauma or disturbance. Given my husband's cardiac history, I suspect a medical event, possibly genetic." The calculating reference to a genetic condition, when no such history existed in William's family, would later be identified by prosecutors as the first step in Emma's attempt to establish a natural cause narrative for death she had meticulously orchestrated. Baltimore police officers, James Donovan and Patricia Chen, were the first to arrive at the scene at 7:52 a.m., followed minutes later by emergency medical technicians who formally pronounced William and Thomas Peterson dead at the scene after confirming the absence of vital signs and noting that both bodies already showed signs of rigor mortis, suggesting they had been deceased for several hours. As officers Donovan and Chen secured the Peterson residence and began their preliminary investigation, Emma Peterson received the first of two phone calls that would complete the devastating picture. Sarah's fiancé, Dr. Robert Chen, called in a panic from the Baltimore apartment they shared, reporting that he had returned from an overnight hospital shift to find Sarah unresponsive in their bed. Just 20 minutes later, Michael's administrative assistant called after she and the building manager had entered his Harbor East condo when he failed to appear for an important morning meeting, discovering his body in circumstances identical to those of his father and brother. The Baltimore Police Department immediately recognized the extraordinary nature of 4 related deaths occurring simultaneously and dispatched Detective Dominic Myers from the Homicide Unit to take charge of the rapidly expanding investigation, which now encompassed 3 separate locations across Baltimore's diverse neighborhoods, from the wealth of Guilford to the upscale waterfront condos of Harbor East and the professional residential district where Sarah and Robert had recently purchased their first home. The initial assessment at each scene revealed disturbing similarities that began to shift investigators away from the theory of a medical coincidence or environmental exposure. All 4 victims were found in their beds, appearing to have died in their sleep without signs of struggle or distress, still wearing the clothes they had been in the previous evening, rather than pajamas or nightwear. Each victim had an empty water glass on their bedside table, and in the case of William and Thomas, half-empty bottles of expensive mineral water that matched the brand stocked in the Peterson home's refrigerator. The Baltimore Medical Examiner's Office, led by Dr. Lydia Reeves, made the unusual decision to prioritize all 4 autopsies and conduct them simultaneously with a team of pathologists working in adjacent examination rooms, allowing for real-time comparison of findings across all victims. Detective Myers established a command center at Baltimore Police Headquarters on East Fayette Street, bringing together officers from 3 different precincts to coordinate the collection of evidence and witness statements while a forensic team began processing the Peterson home with particular attention to the kitchen and dining areas, where the family's last meal had been prepared and consumed. The breakthrough came just 18 hours after the bodies were discovered, when preliminary toxicology screenings revealed the presence of zolpidem, the active ingredient in the sleep medication Ambien, in all 4 victims at levels far exceeding the therapeutic dose. Dr. Reeves immediately recognized the significance of this finding, especially when additional blood work showed that all 4 victims had identical concentrations of the drug in their systems, 10.8 milligrams per liter, a pharmacological impossibility given the different ages, weights, metabolism rates, and alcohol consumption levels of the victims. This anomalous finding became the foundational clue that transformed what might have been dismissed as a tragic medical coincidence into an active homicide investigation focused on deliberate poisoning by someone with knowledge of pharmaceuticals and access to all 4 victims. The identical concentration levels defied natural biological variation and pointed to a calculated administration of the drug with the specific intent to cause death, likely delivered in liquid form to mask its bitter taste in the victims' drinks throughout the evening. Detective Myers immediately requested a search warrant for the Peterson home's medicine cabinets and any prescription records associated with family members, while also securing Emma Peterson's cell phone and computer as part of the expanded investigation. The search revealed that Emma had a prescription for Ambien to treat chronic insomnia, with pharmacy records showing she had obtained refills 3 times in the 2 months preceding the murders, far more frequently than her prescribed dosage would require. Baltimore's unique geography of wealth and poverty became apparent as investigators moved between the Peterson mansion in Guilford and the city's downtown pharmacy district, where Emma had filled her prescriptions at 3 different locations, using her judge's credentials to overcome any questions about the frequency of her refill requests. The prescription bottles found in Emma's bathroom contained far fewer pills than the recent refill dates would suggest, with investigators calculating a discrepancy of approximately 60 tablets that could not be accounted for by normal usage at her prescribed dose of 1 tablet nightly. As the toxicology findings were confirmed by secondary testing, Detective Myers and his team conducted their first formal interview with Emma Peterson, who maintained the composed demeanor that had characterized her judicial career. Emma claimed complete surprise at the toxicology results, suggesting that perhaps William had been self-medicating for stress related to his new position, or that the children might have taken sleep aids to ensure rest before their busy workdays. The interview, conducted in a small conference room at Baltimore Police Headquarters with its views of the city's downtown business district, lasted 4 hours and revealed Emma's remarkable ability to project confusion and grief while deflecting questions about her own prescription medication and her whereabouts throughout the evening of September 11th. Detective Myers, a 20-year veteran of Baltimore's homicide unit who had investigated cases across all of the city's disparate neighborhoods, from the affluent harbor areas to the struggling streets immortalized in The Wire, later described Emma Peterson as the most controlled suspect I've ever interviewed, like she was still on the bench judging us instead of the other way around. The investigation took a crucial turn when forensic analysts processed the glassware collected from the Peterson home's dishwasher, which had not yet been run after the family dinner. Trace amounts of zolpidem were detected in the wine glasses and water glasses used by the victims, but not in the glass that Emma had used, which showed residue of the same Cabernet but no medication. Similarly, a half-empty bottle of San Pellegrino mineral water found in the master bedroom showed concentration levels of the drug consistent with what was found in William Peterson's system, while an identical bottle on Emma's side of the bed contained only water. Baltimore's crime lab, housed in a modern facility that contrasted sharply with the aging infrastructure of much of the city, worked around the clock to process these findings, with technicians recognizing that they were building a case against one of the city's former judicial figures, someone who had sent countless defendants to prison from her position on the bench and who understood intimately how evidence was collected, processed, and presented in criminal proceedings. The final piece of physical evidence emerged from the autopsy findings, which confirmed that all 4 victims had died from respiratory depression caused by zolpidem toxicity, with contributing factors of alcohol consumption that had enhanced the drug's lethal effects. The medical examiner's report concluded that the deaths had occurred between approximately midnight and 2 a.m. on September 12th, with William and Thomas dying in the Peterson home, while Michael and Sarah succumbed in their respective residences after returning from the family dinner. Dr. Reeves noted in her report that the identical concentration levels in all 4 victims represented an impossibility in natural circumstances and could only be achieved through careful measurement and deliberate administration of the substance with lethal intent. This scientific confirmation of what had become the foundational clue, the statistically impossible identical toxicology results, transformed the investigation from exploration of a potential crime to building a case against the person who had access to the medication, the knowledge to calculate lethal doses, and the opportunity to administer it to all 4 victims. Emma Peterson herself. 6 days after the bodies were discovered, Detective Myers assembled his investigative findings and presented them to Baltimore City State's Attorney Natalie Warren, who reviewed the evidence and authorized charges of 4 counts of first-degree murder against Emma Peterson. In the early morning hours of September 18, 2020, Emma Peterson was arrested at the Guilford home, where the murders had begun, taken into custody by the same officers who had responded to her 911 call less than a week earlier. As she was led out of the house in handcuffs, neighbors gathered on the manicured lawns of the surrounding mansions, watching in disbelief as one of Baltimore's most respected legal figures was placed in the back of a police cruiser, the flashing lights illuminating the colonial facades of one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The news of Emma Peterson's arrest spread rapidly through Baltimore's interconnected communities, from the courthouse where she had once presided to the hospital where her husband and daughter had worked, creating shockwaves that would continue to reverberate throughout the trial and beyond as the city grappled with how someone entrusted with upholding justice could commit such a calculated act of familicide. Detective Dominic Myers had seen his share of Baltimore's darkest crimes during his 20-year career with the Homicide Unit, from gang executions in the city's western districts to domestic murders in the wealthy enclaves along the harbor. But the Peterson case struck him as uniquely calculating from the moment the identical toxicology reports landed on his desk. Myers and his partner, Detective Alicia Ramsey, had been working the case since the 4 bodies were discovered, methodically building a timeline of the family's final evening together through credit card receipts, security camera footage, and witness statements from neighbors who had observed the family arriving for their dinner gathering. The breakthrough in identifying Emma Peterson as the prime suspect came not only from the physical evidence of the Ambien in all 4 victim systems, but also from the digital trail that began to emerge as investigators obtained warrants for Emma's electronic devices and financial records. Myers had instructed his team to proceed with extraordinary caution, knowing that the suspect's judicial background meant she would be intimately familiar with investigative procedures and potential weaknesses in evidence collection that could later be exploited by a defense team. The most damning evidence emerged from Emma Peterson's cell phone, which contained a series of text messages exchanged with a contact identified only as AD in her phone. Baltimore Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit recovered messages dating back 18 months that revealed Emma had been engaged in an affair with Alexander Drake, a 47-year-old attorney who had frequently appeared in her courtroom before her retirement from the bench. The messages painted a disturbing picture of a woman increasingly resentful of her family obligations and fantasizing about a different life. "Soon we won't have to hide anymore," Emma had texted 3 days before the murders, followed by, "I'm finalizing arrangements for our fresh start," the day before the family dinner. Drake's responses were more cautious but equally incriminating, with messages like, "Are you sure this is what you want? There's no going back once it's done. And I've looked at properties in Portugal as you suggested. No extradition, just as you said." When confronted with these messages during his initial interview, Drake admitted to the affair, but claimed he had no knowledge of Emma's plans to murder her family, believing her references to a fresh start related to her intention to file for divorce. As detectives Myers and Ramsey dug deeper into Emma Peterson's background, the facade of the respected judge and devoted family matriarch began to crumble, revealing a woman who had grown increasingly dissatisfied with her life despite her professional success and financial security. Interviews with her former law clerks revealed that Emma had become noticeably bitter in the years before her retirement, often making disparaging remarks about her husband's dedication to his patients at the expense of their marriage, and expressing frustration that her adult children continued to rely on her for emotional support despite having established their own lives. Baltimore's social structure, with its tight-knit networks of professional and neighborhood connections, meant that investigators could construct a detailed picture of Emma's deteriorating relationship with her family through discreet interviews with members of the various clubs, boards, and organizations where the Petersons had maintained active membership. The portrait that emerged was of a woman who had once taken pride in her family's accomplishments, but had gradually come to view them as burdens constraining her freedom and preventing her from pursuing the relationship with Drake that had become her obsession. Financial records provided another crucial thread in the tapestry of evidence, with bank statements showing that Emma had opened a new account at a small private bank in Baltimore's financial district 6 months before the murders, making regular cash deposits that totaled just under $250,000. The source of these funds appeared to be systematic withdrawals from the various investment accounts she jointly held with William, always in amounts under $10,000, to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, a technique that her judicial experience would have made her well aware of. Additionally, investigators discovered that Emma had secretly taken out additional life insurance policies on William and each of her children approximately 9 months before the murders, naming Hoke herself as the sole beneficiary and using her legal knowledge to create a complex trust arrangement that would have allowed her to access the combined $8 million payout with minimal scrutiny. Detective Ramsey, whose background in financial crimes proved invaluable to the investigation, noted that Emma had specifically selected insurance companies without cross-referencing databases, ensuring that neither William nor the children would receive notifications about the new policies taken out in their names. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from Emma Peterson's internet search history, which revealed months of research into undetectable poisons, the effects of Ambien overdoses, and techniques for making deaths appear natural. Baltimore's proximity to multiple university medical libraries had allowed Emma to conduct research using public computers at these facilities, but she had grown careless in the weeks leading up to the murders, using her home computer to search for information on how long after death can medications be detected and identical drug levels in different bodies. The digital evidence showed that Emma had methodically planned the murders, researching everything from the specific effects of combining Ambien with alcohol to the precise timing needed between administration of the drug and expected death. Knowledge she used to ensure that Michael and Sarah would be able to drive home safely before the full effects of the medication took hold, thereby avoiding suspicion that might arise from deaths occurring simultaneously in the same location. The investigation also uncovered Emma Peterson's careful efforts to establish an alibi and control the narrative around the deaths, beginning with her calculated 911 call suggesting a genetic cardiac condition as the cause of death. Security camera footage from the Peterson home's sophisticated system, installed years earlier at Emma's insistence after a series of break-ins in neighboring properties, showed her moving between bedrooms during the night of the murders, checking on William and Thomas multiple times between midnight and 3 a.m., behavior inconsistent with her later claim that she had taken her own prescribed Ambien and slept through the night undisturbed. Additionally, Emma had sent emails to William's colleagues at Johns Hopkins Hospital early the next morning, before supposedly discovering the bodies, inquiring about the hospital's bereavement policies, and the process for accessing William's life insurance information, actions that suggested foreknowledge of his death and a preoccupation with the financial aftermath, rather than the shock and grief that would be expected. In a strategic decision that reflected both his experience with high-profile cases and his understanding of Baltimore's complex social hierarchy, Detective Myers arranged for Emma Peterson's arrest to be carried out quietly in the early morning hours, minimizing media presence and potential disruption. In the exclusive Guilford neighborhood where many of Baltimore's elite resided, the arrest warrant signed by Judge Marcus Thompson, a colleague who had once worked alongside Emma in the Baltimore Circuit Court, authorized charges of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances of multiple victims and premeditation, making Emma eligible for the death penalty under Maryland law if convicted. The irony that Emma would now face the same justice system she had once administered was not lost on the investigators or the prosecutors preparing to try the case, creating an unprecedented situation where the defendant's intimate knowledge of Baltimore's courts and judicial personalities would need to be factored into every aspect of the prosecution's strategy. Following her arrest, Emma Peterson was transported to Baltimore's Central Booking and Intake Center, the same facility where thousands of defendants she had sentenced over her judicial career had been processed. Her mugshot, showing the former judge in the same booking attire worn by all detainees regardless of social status or background, quickly became one of the most startling images in Baltimore's recent criminal history, a stark visual representation of the fall from respected jurist to accused mass murderer. Emma declined to make any statement during her initial appearance before a bail commissioner, who ordered her held without bail pending a formal hearing due to the severity of the charges and the methodical planning evident in the alleged crimes. As she was led to the women's detention section of the Baltimore City Detention Center, the former judge encountered the harsh reality of a system she had previously viewed only from the elevated perspective of the bench, experiencing firsthand the processing procedures and confined conditions she had sentenced countless others to over her 2-decade judicial career. The emergence of Emma Peterson as the prime suspect in the murder of her entire family sent shockwaves through Baltimore's legal community, where she had been viewed as a model of judicial propriety and ethical conduct. Courthouse employees who had worked with her for years struggled to reconcile the stern but fair judge they had known with the calculated killer depicted in the charging documents, while attorneys who had argued cases before her re-examined their interactions for any signs of the psychological deterioration that must have preceded such an extreme act of violence. Baltimore's unique position as a city where extreme wealth and poverty exist in close proximity, where the gleaming harbor developments stand in stark contrast to the struggling neighborhoods just blocks away, created a backdrop for a crime that similarly juxtaposed outward perfection with inner darkness. As news of Emma Peterson's arrest spread throughout the city, from the marble corridors of the courthouse to the working-class neighborhoods of East Baltimore, citizens grappled with the disturbing realization that the person they had trusted to uphold justice had allegedly committed one of the most comprehensive acts of familicide in the city's history, using her knowledge of the law not to protect her community, but to plan and nearly escape punishment for the methodical murder of her husband and children. In the weeks following Emma Peterson's arrest, prosecutors Natalie Warren and James Mitchell established a special task force within the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office to build what they knew would be one of the most high-profile murder cases in Maryland's recent history. Warren, a veteran prosecutor with 15 years of experience handling complex homicide cases, recognized the unique challenges presented by a defendant who had not only served as a judge in the same courthouse where she would stand trial, but who had also presided over cases Warren herself had argued early in her career. The task force headquarters was established in a secluded conference room on the top floor of the courthouse, walls covered with timeline charts and evidence photographs, deliberately located far from the regular courtrooms to minimize the chance of information leaks or accidental encounters with potential jurors. Baltimore's legal community, tightly interconnected through professional and social relationships that spanned the city's stark economic divides, buzzed with speculation about the case, creating an atmosphere where prosecutors knew that every detail of their strategy would be scrutinized not only by the defense, but by hundreds of legal professionals who had appeared before Judge Peterson during her time on the bench. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case remained the foundational clue that had first transformed the investigation from a medical mystery into a homicide inquiry: the identical levels of zolpidem found in all 4 victims. Dr. Lydia Reeves, Baltimore's chief medical examiner, worked closely with forensic toxicologists from the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy to develop a comprehensive explanation of why this pharmacological anomaly could only be explained by deliberate poisoning. The experts created detailed visual presentations showing how the human body processes medications at different rates based on factors including age, weight, liver function, and concurrent alcohol consumption, demonstrating that the statistical probability of 4 different individuals metabolizing the drug to achieve identical blood concentrations was effectively 0. This scientific foundation was strengthened when analysts from the Baltimore Police Crime Lab matched the specific pharmaceutical signature of the zolpidem found in the victims to the prescription medication bottles found in Emma Peterson's bathroom, confirming that the same batch of pills had been used in all 4 poisonings. Financial investigations added another crucial dimension to the prosecution's case as forensic accountants traced Emma Peterson's methodical preparation for life after her family's elimination. Prosecutor Warren obtained records from 27 different financial institutions, revealing that Emma had not only accumulated cash in her secret account, but had also researched international banking options in countries with limited cooperation with U.S. authorities. Her internet search history showed multiple visits to websites about relocating to Portugal, where she and Drake had apparently planned to settle using the life insurance proceeds from her family's deaths. The financial evidence painted a picture of a woman who had spent nearly a year preparing for her new life, gradually liquidating assets in ways designed to minimize attention while simultaneously creating new insurance policies that would provide a substantial windfall once her family was eliminated. The prosecution team created a detailed timeline showing how Emma's financial preparations aligned perfectly with the development of her relationship with Alexander Drake, with each step toward murder coinciding with an escalation in their affair and more concrete plans for their future together. The digital evidence against Emma Peterson proved to be among the most damning aspects of the prosecution's case, with her text messages to Drake revealing not just the affair, but increasingly explicit references to removing the obstacles to their happiness. Baltimore's Digital Forensics Unit recovered deleted messages in which Emma had written, "I've found a solution that will be quick, painless, and look natural. No one will question a family medical emergency, especially with W's history of working long hours and stress." Another message sent just 2 days before the murders read, "After Friday, we'll be free to start our new life. I've taken care of all the details, and the trust will provide everything we need for decades of happiness." Drake's responses, while more circumspect, suggested at minimum an awareness of Emma's intentions, with messages like, "Are you sure there's no other way? This seems extreme even for us. And I've checked the properties you liked in Lisbon. We could be there by November if everything goes according to plan." These exchanges, reconstructed in chronological order, revealed the calculated nature of Emma's planning and directly contradicted her initial claims of having no knowledge of how her family had ingested the lethal medication. Pharmacy records became another crucial element, in building the case, as investigators documented Emma's systematic accumulation of the Ambien she would use to poison her family. Records showed she had filled her prescription at 3 different pharmacies in Baltimore over the 2 months preceding the murders, each time using her position as a former judge to override questions about the frequency of refills. The pharmacist at Baltimore Apothecary on Charles Street recalled Emma explaining that she was experiencing unusual stress due to family matters and needed additional medication to manage her insomnia, invoking her judicial title to discourage further questions. This testimony would directly connect Emma to the murder weapon and demonstrate her abuse of her former position to obtain the means to carry out her plan, a pattern of behavior that prosecutors argued reflected both premeditation and consciousness of guilt. The contrast between Emma's privileged ability to obtain controlled substances through her professional status and the harsh sentences she had often imposed on defendants charged with prescription drug offenses became a subtle but powerful theme in the prosecution's narrative, highlighting the hypocrisy that had characterized her final years on the bench. The investigation into the murder's execution focused on reconstructing the events of September 11, 2020, with particular attention to how Emma had administered the lethal doses without arousing suspicion. Forensic analysis of the glassware recovered from the Peterson home revealed trace amounts of powdered zolpidem in the bottom of wine glasses and water bottles, suggesting that Emma had ground the pills into a fine powder that could be dissolved in liquid. Security camera footage from the Peterson home's kitchen, installed as part of their high-end security system, captured Emma alone in the kitchen between dinner courses, handling bottles and glasses in a manner consistent with adding substances to drinks. The prosecution constructed a detailed timeline showing that Emma had likely administered increasing doses throughout the evening, ensuring that her husband and son would not taste the medication in their after-dinner drinks while calculating doses for Michael and Sarah that would allow them to drive home safely before the full effects took hold. This level of planning demonstrated not only Emma's intent, but her clinical approach to the murders, using her knowledge of pharmaceuticals to orchestrate deaths that would initially appear natural and unconnected to her. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence came from Emma's computer, where forensic analysts discovered a document titled Timeline.docs in a hidden folder, last modified the day before the murders. The document contained a minute-by-minute schedule for the evening of September 11th, including notes on when to serve each course, when to offer specific drinks to each family member, and projected times of death based on body weight and estimated alcohol consumption. The document included a section labeled After with a checklist of tasks including call 911, 7:45 a.m., contact W's colleagues about genetic condition, begin funeral arrangements, and call insurance company, day 3. This digital roadmap to murder, found on Emma's personal laptop behind multiple password protections, provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of premeditation and methodical planning that would be difficult for any defense attorney to explain away as coincidence or misinterpretation. The document reflected the mind of a judge accustomed to managing complex schedules and foreseeing contingencies now applied to the systematic elimination of her own family. As the case against Emma Peterson solidified, prosecutors Warren and Mitchell focused on establishing the motive that would explain how a respected judge could transform into a calculating killer willing to eliminate her entire family. Through interviews with colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances from various segments of Baltimore's stratified social world, investigators pieced together the psychological deterioration that had preceded the murders. Former law clerks described Emma becoming increasingly resentful of her family obligations in her final years on the bench, making comments about feeling trapped in a life she had outgrown, and expressing envy of colleagues who had divorced and started fresh. Friends from the Baltimore Country Club recalled Emma becoming noticeably distant from William at social events, often arriving and leaving separately and speaking dismissively about his career accomplishments that she had once proudly highlighted. The most revealing insights came from Emma's personal journal, discovered in a locked drawer in her home office, which documented her growing obsession with Alexander Drake and her fantasy of a new life unencumbered by family responsibilities, with entries becoming increasingly explicit about her desire for freedom at any cost. The relationship between Emma Peterson and Alexander Drake became a central focus of the investigation, with prosecutors working to determine whether Drake should face charges as a co-conspirator. Detailed analysis of their communications revealed that while Drake was aware of Emma's dissatisfaction with her family and her desire for a new life with him, the evidence fell short of proving he had direct knowledge of her murderous intentions. Drake, when confronted with the text messages suggesting his awareness of Emma's plans, claimed he had interpreted her references to removing obstacles and solving problems as relating to divorce proceedings and financial settlements rather than murder. His cooperation with investigators, including providing access to his own devices and financial records, ultimately led prosecutors to conclude that while Drake had been morally complicit in an affair with a married woman that created the motive for her crimes, the evidence was insufficient to charge him as an accomplice to the murders themselves. This decision, while pragmatic from a legal perspective, created controversy throughout Baltimore, where many felt that Drake's apparent willingness to benefit from the deaths, even if he hadn't actively participated in planning them, should have resulted in criminal charges. By late October 2020, 6 weeks after the murders, the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office had assembled what Natalie Warren described to her team as one of the most comprehensive circumstantial cases in Maryland history. The evidence established a clear timeline from Emma Peterson's initial dissatisfaction with her family life, through her affair with Drake, her methodical planning of the murders, the calculated execution on September 11th, and her subsequent attempts to establish a natural cause narrative and access the financial benefits of her family's deaths. The prosecution had constructed a narrative that explained not just how the murders had been committed, but why a woman who had reached the pinnacle of professional success would risk everything to eliminate her family, portraying Emma as someone who had grown to see her husband and children not as beloved family members, but as impediments to the new life she had envisioned with her lover. As the case moved toward trial, scheduled to begin in January 2021, Baltimore's legal community braced for proceedings that would not only determine Emma Peterson's fate, but would also force a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that someone entrusted with upholding justice had committed one of the most calculated acts of familicide in the city's history, using her knowledge of the law not to serve justice, but to plan and nearly escape punishment for murder. The arrest of Emma Peterson took place at 5:30 a.m. on September 18, 2020, as a tactical decision by Detective Dominic Myers to minimize media attention and neighborhood disruption in Baltimore's exclusive Guilford district. A team of 6 officers from the Baltimore Police Department's Warrant Apprehension Task Force surrounded the Peterson home in the pre-dawn darkness, positioning themselves strategically around the property's perimeter while Myers and Detective Alicia Ramsey approached the front door. The grand colonial house stood silent in the early morning light, its manicured lawn and imposing facade masking the horror that had occurred within its walls just days earlier. Myers rang the doorbell, the chime echoing through the house that now contained only one living occupant, where a family of 5 had once resided. Emma Peterson answered the door in a silk robe, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, showing no surprise at finding police on her doorstep, a reaction that Myers would later describe as the first confirmation that she had been expecting us. When Myers presented the arrest warrant, Emma's response was measured and controlled, betraying none of the shock or outrage that might be expected from someone wrongfully accused of murdering their family. "I need to change clothes and contact my attorney," she stated calmly, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she had used from the bench for over 20 years. Detective Myers allowed Emma to make a brief call to defense attorney Howard Feinstein, a prominent Baltimore lawyer known for representing high-profile clients, before officers escorted her to her bedroom, where a female officer supervised as she changed into a conservative navy pantsuit, attire more appropriate for presiding over a courtroom than being processed as a murder suspect. Throughout this process, Emma maintained the composed demeanor that had characterized her judicial career, her only visible reaction being a slight tightening of her jaw when Detective Ramsey formally read the charges. 4 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances of multiple victims, deliberate premeditation, and poisoning. The drive from Guilford to Baltimore's central booking and intake facility provided a study in contrasts as the police cruiser carrying Emma Peterson traveled from the tree-lined streets of Old Money, Baltimore, through increasingly distressed neighborhoods, passing blocks of vacant row houses and corners where early morning drug deals were already underway. Emma sat silently in the back seat, gazing out at the city she had served as a judge, a city whose extreme disparities of wealth and opportunity she had witnessed daily in her courtroom, but had largely been insulated from in her personal life. Officers at the intake facility, many of whom recognized the former judge immediately, processed Emma with professional detachment, though several later admitted to feeling unsettled by fingerprinting and photographing a woman who had once determined the fates of countless defendants in that same system. The booking photograph of Emma Peterson, showing her still perfectly composed, but now wearing the standard issue yellow jumpsuit assigned to all detainees at the facility, would become one of the most iconic images in Baltimore criminal history, a stark visual representation of the fall from judicial authority to accused murderer. Following the booking process, Detectives Myers and Ramsey conducted their formal interrogation of Emma Peterson in a small, windowless room within the central booking complex, the same type of space where countless suspects had been questioned before facing her in court. The room was deliberately stark, containing only a metal table, 3 chairs, and a video recording system that would document every word and gesture of the interview for future courtroom use. Emma had waived her right to have her attorney present during questioning, a decision that surprised the detectives but reflected her confidence in her ability to control the narrative, and perhaps her fundamental belief that her judicial experience made her immune to standard interrogation techniques. Myers began the interview with questions about the family dinner on September 11th, asking Emma to walk through the evening chronologically while Ramsey observed her body language and noted inconsistencies for follow-up questions. Emma provided a detailed account of the dinner that aligned with the physical evidence investigators had already collected, describing the menu, the wine selection, and the conversations among family members with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed this narrative extensively. When Myers shifted to questions about her prescription medication, Emma maintained her composed facade, but subtle changes in her breathing pattern and increased hand movements suggested growing anxiety beneath her controlled exterior. "I've taken Ambien for insomnia for nearly 5 years," she explained, her voice steady, despite the physiological indicators of stress that Ramsey was documenting. "William and the children knew about my prescription. Perhaps they helped themselves to my medication without my knowledge, though I can't imagine why all 4 would do so simultaneously." This explanation, delivered with the authoritative tone she had used to address attorneys in her courtroom, represented her first attempt to deflect suspicion by suggesting the victims had somehow contributed to their own deaths. The interrogation strategy shifted when Myers presented Emma with the toxicology reports showing identical levels of zolpidem in all 4 victims, explaining the statistical impossibility of such findings occurring naturally or accidentally. These results indicate deliberate administration of precisely measured doses, Myers stated, sliding the laboratory reports across the table. In your experience as a judge, how many cases have you seen where coincidence explained this kind of evidence? The question, deliberately framed to invoke her professional expertise, momentarily disrupted Emma's composure, her hand pausing midair as she reached for the reports. "The science can be wrong," she replied after a calculated pause, her voice slightly higher than before. "Labs make mistakes. Samples get contaminated. Any experienced jurist knows that technical evidence must be scrutinized carefully before drawing conclusions." This response, attempting to undermine the foundational clue that had launched the homicide investigation, revealed Emma's strategy of using her judicial knowledge to create reasonable doubt, a strategy that might have been effective in front of a jury, but appeared transparently self-serving in the interrogation room. The most revealing moment of the interrogation came when Myers confronted Emma with the evidence of her affair with Alexander Drake, producing printouts of text messages recovered from her phone in which she had discussed removing obstacles and starting a new life with Drake after taking care of the details. For the first time, Emma's judicial mask slipped, color draining from her face as she realized the extent of the digital evidence investigators had recovered. "Those messages are being taken out of context," she insisted, her voice losing its practiced calm. "Alexander and I are colleagues with a close professional relationship. Any discussion of obstacles referred to professional challenges, not my family." When Ramsey countered by revealing they had already interviewed Drake, who had admitted to the affair and provided additional messages from his own devices, Emma's strategy shifted from denial to minimization. "An affair is not a crime," she stated, attempting to reassert control over the narrative. "Thousands of people have extramarital relationships without committing murder. You're building a circumstantial case based on a coincidental medical tragedy and private conversations that have been misinterpreted." The interrogation entered its most intense phase when Myers presented Emma with the timelined docs document recovered from her laptop, which detailed the planned sequence of events for the murders, including specific times for administering the poison and expectations for when each victim would die. This concrete evidence of premeditation visibly shook Emma, whose training as a judge had taught her the devastating impact such documentation would have on any potential defense. Her response reflected a significant shift in strategy, moving from denial to an attempt to undermine the chain of custody. "That document could have been planted or altered," she argued, her legal mind grasping for procedural challenges. "I want to know exactly who had access to my computer, what forensic protocols were followed, and whether the metadata has been verified by independent experts." This pivot to technical challenges rather than substantive denial of authorship was not lost on the detectives, who recognized it as the response of someone who knew the evidence was authentic but was searching for procedural grounds to exclude it from consideration. Throughout the 9-hour interrogation, Emma Peterson attempted to leverage her position as a former judge to intimidate the investigators, making references to cases where she had ruled on similar evidence and suggesting that her connections within Baltimore's judicial system would ensure intense scrutiny of their methods. "Detective Myers, I've overseen hundreds of homicide cases," she stated, approximately 5 hours into the questioning. "I've dismissed charges when police work didn't meet proper standards. I've seen how evidence can be misinterpreted when investigators become fixated on a particular suspect." This attempt to establish authority in the interrogation room reflected Emma's inability to fully process her changed status, from the judge who evaluated evidence to the suspect whose actions were being judged. Myers countered this tactic effectively by maintaining formal respect while subtly emphasizing her current position, addressing her consistently as Ms. Peterson rather than Judge, and periodically reminding her that she was now on the other side of the justice system she had administered for decades. The most damning moment came when investigators confronted Emma with evidence of her financial preparations, including the secret bank account, the additional life insurance policies taken out on her family members, and her research into Portuguese residence options. When presented with bank records showing systematic cash withdrawals and transfers that corresponded with her planning timeline, Emma's strategy shifted again, this time toward rationalization. "My financial planning was prudent preparation for retirement, nothing more," she claimed, though her explanation could not account for the secrecy surrounding these transactions or their timing in relation to the murders. When Ramsey inquired why Emma had researched countries without extradition treaties with the United States, her response revealed the entitlement that had characterized her approach to both her judicial career and the murders. "As a judge, I've always been interested in international legal systems. My research was professional curiosity, not preparation for flight." This explanation, delivered with the expectation that her word as a former judge would be accepted without question, demonstrated how fundamentally Emma had failed to understand that her former status now served as an aggravating factor rather than a shield against accountability. After 9 hours of questioning, Emma Peterson finally requested her attorney, effectively ending the interrogation. As officers prepared to transfer her to the Baltimore City Detention Center to await her bail hearing, she made a final statement that revealed both her narcissism and her fundamental misunderstanding of how thoroughly the evidence had undermined her position. "This case will never reach a jury. The state's attorney knows better than to prosecute a former judge on such flimsy evidence." This declaration, made with the certainty of someone accustomed to having the final word, would prove to be her most significant miscalculation. The interrogation video, which captured both this statement and her earlier attempts to undermine the evidence, would become a centerpiece of the prosecution's case, allowing jurors to observe firsthand how Emma Peterson had attempted to use her judicial knowledge and authority to escape accountability for the calculated murder of her family. As Emma was led from the interrogation room to the transportation area where she would be taken to the detention center, she passed through a corridor lined with holding cells containing defendants awaiting initial appearances, many of whom recognized the former judge who had sentenced them or their acquaintances in the past. The murmurs that spread through the cells as the detained individuals realized that Judge Peterson was now wearing the same jumpsuit they were created a moment of profound symbolic significance in the case, a visible representation of the principle that no one, not even those who have administered justice, stands above the law. For Detective Myers, who had investigated hundreds of homicides across Baltimore's disparate neighborhoods during his career, the sight of Emma Peterson being processed into the detention system, where she had sent so many others, represented the fundamental purpose of his work, ensuring that justice applied equally to all of Baltimore's citizens, regardless of their wealth, position, or power. As the heavy steel doors of the detention center closed behind the former judge, the case entered its next phase, moving from investigation toward a trial that would captivate the city and force a reckoning with the darkness that had lurked behind the respectable facade of one of Baltimore's most prominent legal figures. On January 11, 2021, 4 months after the murders of the Peterson family, the Baltimore City Circuit Court became the focal point of national media attention as the trial of former Judge Emma Peterson began. The historic courthouse, with its imposing neoclassical architecture and marble columns, had been Emma's professional home for over 2 decades, the place where she had wielded considerable power and built her reputation for stern, no-nonsense justice. Now she entered the building not through the private judicial entrance she had used for years, but through the public doors, flanked by corrections officers rather than law clerks, her Navy prison-issued suit a stark contrast to the designer attire she had worn on the bench. The trial had been assigned to Judge Marcus Thompson, a respected jurist who had once been Emma's colleague, but who now faced the extraordinary task of ensuring a fair proceeding when the defendant knew every procedural rule, every courtroom strategy, and every potential appeal point that might arise during the case. The courtroom selected for the trial was not Emma's former domain on the third floor, but the largest courtroom in the building, Courtroom 400, which could accommodate the extensive media presence and public interest the case had generated. Baltimore's diverse social strata were represented in the audience as the proceedings began, from legal professionals who had appeared before Emma during her judicial career to family members of defendants she had sentenced, all united by their fascination with the spectacular fall of a woman who had once sat in judgment of others. The jury selection process had been painstaking, requiring a special expanded jury pool due to Emma's extensive visibility in the Baltimore community and the widespread publicity surrounding the case. After 2 weeks of voir dire, during which defense attorney Howard Feinstein challenged every potential juror with any connection to the legal system, a jury of 9 women and 3 men was seated, representing the racial and economic diversity that characterized Baltimore itself. From a retired steelworker from Dundalk to a university professor from Roland Park, from an East Baltimore school teacher to a Harbor East financial analyst. State's Attorney Natalie Warren opened the prosecution's case with a methodical presentation that established the foundational clue at the center of the state's case, the identical levels of zolpidem found in all 4 victims. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Warren began, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, "this case will present you with many pieces of evidence. Text, messages showing the defendant's desire to eliminate her family, financial records showing her preparation for a new life, and a detailed timeline written in her own hand, scheduling the deaths of her husband and children. But at the core of this case is a single, irrefutable scientific fact. The toxicology reports showing identical medication levels in all 4 victims, a pharmacological impossibility that can only be explained by deliberate, calculated poisoning. Warren, a prosecutor known for her clear, straightforward presentations, deliberately avoided inflammatory language or emotional appeals in her opening, instead focusing on establishing the logical progression from this central clue to the conclusion that Emma Peterson had methodically murdered her family to pursue a new life with her lover. Defense attorney Howard Feinstein, one of Baltimore's most prominent criminal defense lawyers and a former federal prosecutor, presented an opening statement that set the tone for Emma Peterson's defense strategy. Rather than directly challenging the evidence, Feinstein focused on creating reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative explanations and attacking the investigation's methodology. "The prosecution will show you a mountain of circumstantial evidence," Feinstein acknowledged, his commanding presence drawing the jury's attention, "but what they cannot show you is a single witness who saw Emma Peterson poison anyone. What they cannot explain is why a respected judge with an unblemished record would suddenly commit such an unimaginable act." Feinstein's strategy became clear as he suggested that William Peterson, struggling with the pressure of his new position as chief of cardiology, might have obtained his wife's medication and administered it to himself and the children as a family solution to the stress they were all experiencing, a theory that sought to explain the identical toxicology results while absolving Emma of direct responsibility. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had arrived at the Peterson home on the morning after the murders, establishing the unusual calmness of Emma's demeanor when reporting the deaths of her husband and son. Paramedic Jasmine Williams testified that in her 15 years, responding to sudden deaths in homes across Baltimore, from the poorest neighborhoods to the wealthiest enclaves. She had never encountered someone so composed after discovering deceased family members. Williams described Emma Peterson as almost clinical in her descriptions of finding the bodies, noting that she had already placed calls about funeral arrangements before emergency personnel had completed their initial assessment of the scene. This testimony established an early behavioral indicator of premeditation, suggesting that Emma had been prepared for the deaths she had orchestrated rather than shocked by an unexpected tragedy. The scientific foundation of the case was laid through the testimony of Dr. Lydia Reeves, Baltimore's chief medical examiner, who walked the jury through the autopsies of all 4 victims and the toxicology findings that had transformed a seemingly natural death investigation into a murder case. Using detailed visual presentations designed to make complex pharmacology accessible to lay jurors, Dr. Reeves explained how the human body processes medications at different rates based on numerous physiological factors. For all 4 victims to have identical concentrations of 10.8 milligrams per liter of Zolpidem in their systems defies natural possibility, she testified, her expertise earned through decades of forensic work in Baltimore's varied death investigations. Given the victims' different ages, weights, metabolism rates, and alcohol consumption, we would expect to see variations of at least 15 to 20% in how their bodies processed the medication, even if they had all voluntarily taken identical doses at the identical time, which itself would be an extraordinary coincidence. The prosecution methodically connected this foundational scientific evidence to Emma Peterson through pharmacy records and physical evidence recovered from the Peterson home. Pharmacist David Chen testified about Emma's frequent refills of her Ambien prescription in the months preceding the murders, describing how she had used her position as a judge to override the system's safeguards against early refills. When I questioned the frequency of her refill requests, Judge Peterson informed me that as an officer of the court, she was well aware of the regulations and didn't appreciate having her integrity questioned, Chen recalled, his testimony establishing both Emma's access to the murder weapon and her willingness to use her judicial authority for personal advantage. This testimony was corroborated by evidence from the Peterson home, where forensic technician Marcus Johnson had discovered trace amounts of crushed Zolpidem in a mortar and pestle in the kitchen, matching the residue found in the victim's drinking glasses and the chemical signature of Emma's prescription medication. The digital evidence presented by the prosecution provided the jury with insight into Emma Peterson's motive and planning, transforming the case from a scientific puzzle into a comprehensible human story of dissatisfaction, betrayal, and calculated elimination. Baltimore Police Department's digital forensics specialist Aisha Wilson testified about recovering deleted text messages between Emma and Alexander Drake that explicitly discussed their plans for a life together after removing obstacles and solving the family problem. Wilson walked the jury through Emma's internet search history, which included queries about undetectable poisons, medications that cause natural-looking death, and how long after death can toxicology detect drugs in the months leading up to the murders. The most damning digital evidence came in the form of the Timeline DocEx document found on Emma's laptop, which detailed the murder plan down to the minute, including when each victim would receive their lethal dose and projected times of death based on body weight and metabolism rates. Throughout this presentation of evidence, Emma Peterson maintained the composed judicial demeanor that had characterized her career on the bench, sitting straight-backed at the defense table and taking meticulous notes on a legal pad as if she were still presiding over the case rather than being its subject. This controlled facade began to show cracks only when Alexander Drake took the stand as a prosecution witness, testifying about their 18-month affair and the increasingly explicit conversations about Emma's desire to eliminate her family to start a new life with him. Drake, visibly uncomfortable facing the woman with whom he had planned a future, described Emma's growing resentment toward her family and her statements about wishing they would disappear so she could be free. She told me that with her knowledge of the legal system, she could ensure we'd never face consequences if anything happened to them, Drake testified, his voice lowered as he avoided Emma's gaze from the defense table. I thought she was speaking hypothetically, venting frustrations about her marriage. I never believed she would actually harm them. The prosecution's financial evidence further strengthened their case, with forensic accountant Teresa Rodriguez testifying about Emma's systematic financial preparations in the months before the murders. Rodriguez detailed the secret bank account Emma had established, the life insurance policies she had taken out on her family members without their knowledge, and her research into Portuguese residency requirements and banking regulations. The defendant's financial activities show a clear pattern of preparation for life after her family's deaths, Rodriguez testified, presenting charts showing the timeline correlation between Emma's affair with Drake, her financial maneuvers, and the murders. Her actions were not consistent with normal retirement planning or investment strategy, but rather with someone preparing to access substantial funds and relocate internationally following anticipated deaths. This testimony directly countered the defense's suggestion that the murders might have been impulsive or unplanned, establishing instead a calculated long-term strategy to eliminate Emma's family and profit from their deaths. As the prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, the picture that emerged was of a woman who had become increasingly resentful of her family obligations and fixated on a fantasy of freedom with her younger lover. Former colleagues from the courthouse testified about Emma's changing demeanor in the years before her retirement, describing how she had become more irritable, more dismissive of family obligations, and more openly critical of her husband and children. Her former judicial assistant, Meredith Collins, testified that Emma had once commented after a difficult divorce case, "Some people have the courage to walk away and start over. Others just stay trapped forever in lives they've outgrown." These contextual witnesses helped the prosecution establish the psychological progression that had led a respected judge to view her family not as beloved individuals, but as obstacles to be eliminated in pursuit of a new life, a motive that explained how someone who had spent decades upholding the law could methodically plan and execute the murder of her husband and children. Defense attorney Feinstein fought vigorously against the prosecution's narrative, challenging the chain of custody for digital evidence and suggesting alternative explanations for the financial transactions and Internet searches. His cross-examination of prosecution witnesses focused on creating doubt about the technical evidence, questioning the reliability of toxicology testing procedures, and suggesting that Emma's timeline document could have been created for a crime novel she had mentioned wanting to write after retirement. Feinstein's strategy became increasingly focused on humanizing Emma to the jury, having her appear each day in conservative, appropriate attire, reminiscent of her judicial days rather than prison-issued clothing, and instructing her to maintain the dignified demeanor that had earned her respect during her time on the bench. This approach sought to create cognitive dissonance for the jurors, making it difficult for them to reconcile the composed professional woman before them with the calculating killer described in the prosecution's evidence. As the first phase of the trial concluded, both the prosecution and defense had established their core narratives for the jury. Prosecutor Warren had methodically built a case around the foundational clue of identical toxicology results, connecting this scientific anomaly to Emma Peterson through physical evidence, digital records, financial transactions, and testimony about motive. Defense attorney Feinstein had worked to create reasonable doubt, by suggesting alternative explanations, attacking procedural aspects of the investigation, and presenting Emma as a respected jurist whose character was inconsistent with the crimes alleged. The battle lines were drawn for the next phase of the trial, which would focus on expert testimony regarding the central clue that had launched the investigation and the psychological dimensions that could explain how a judge had transformed into an alleged killer. For the citizens of Baltimore following the case, from the waterfront condos of Harbor East to the struggling neighborhoods of West Baltimore, the trial represented not just the prosecution of a former judge, but a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that those entrusted with administering justice were subject to the same human failings and the same legal consequences as those who had stood before them in court. The eighth day of the trial began with the prosecution's key expert witness, Dr. Jonathan Keller, Chief of Toxicology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and one of the nation's foremost authorities on pharmaceutical toxicology. Dr. Keller, a distinguished scientist with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, brought considerable gravitas to the witness stand as he prepared to explain the foundational clue that had launched the murder investigation. The courtroom fell silent as Prosecutor Natalie Warren guided Dr. Keller through his credentials, establishing his expertise through his 40 years of research, 300 peer-reviewed publications, and extensive experience testifying in criminal cases throughout Maryland and beyond. Baltimore's legal community had turned out in force to hear this testimony, with the courtroom gallery filled with attorneys, judges, and law students eager to witness the scientific evidence against a woman who had once been one of their most respected colleagues. Dr. Keller began his testimony by explaining the basic principles of pharmacokinetics, how drugs are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and eliminated by the human body in terms accessible to the jurors who represented Baltimore's diverse communities and educational backgrounds. Using carefully prepared visual aids that showed the complex journey of medications through the human system, Dr. Keller established the fundamental scientific principle at the heart of the prosecution's case, that individual variations in metabolism make identical drug concentrations in different people essentially impossible without careful, deliberate measurement and administration. In my 40 years studying how pharmaceuticals interact with the human body, Dr. Keller testified, his authoritative voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, I have never seen a case where 4 different individuals naturally process the same medication to achieve identical blood concentrations. The human body simply doesn't work that way. The expert methodically walked the jury through the factors that influence how medications are processed, including age, weight, liver function, gender, genetic factors, and concurrent alcohol consumption. William Peterson was a 64-year-old male weighing approximately 210 pounds, who had consumed 3 glasses of wine with dinner, Dr. Keller explained, using specific details from the autopsy and toxicology reports. His son Thomas was 32 years old, weighed 175 pounds, and had consumed 2 beers. Michael was 38, weighed 195 pounds, and had consumed 2 glasses of wine plus a whiskey. Sarah was 35, weighed 140 pounds, and had consumed 1 glass of wine. He then presented mathematical models showing the expected variations in how each victim would have processed zolpidem based on these factors, demonstrating that natural variation should have resulted in significantly different concentration levels in each victim's bloodstream, even if they had all voluntarily taken identical doses at the same time. The most powerful moment in Dr. Keller's testimony came when Prosecutor Warren asked him to calculate the statistical probability of all 4 victims naturally achieving identical blood concentrations of 10.8 milligrams per liter of zolpidem. Based on established pharmacokinetic principles and the specific biological profiles of the 4 victims, Dr. Keller stated, after referencing his calculations, The probability would be approximately 1 in 1.7 billion. For perspective, that's roughly the same likelihood as someone winning the Powerball lottery 3 consecutive times. This statistical impossibility, presented by a credible scientific authority, reinforced the prosecution's central argument that the identical toxicology results could only be explained by careful, deliberate poisoning carried out by someone with knowledge of pharmaceuticals and access to all 4 victims. Defense attorney Howard Feinstein's cross-examination attempted to undermine Dr. Keller's testimony by suggesting alternative explanations for the identical toxicology results. Dr. Keller, is it possible that the laboratory equipment used to test these samples might have been improperly calibrated, resulting in identical readings despite actual variations in the samples? Feinstein asked, his tone suggesting he was offering the expert a reasonable professional out. Keller's response was measured but firm. The Maryland State Medical Examiner's Office uses multiple testing methodologies precisely to guard against such errors. Each victim's blood was tested using 3 different analytical techniques, all yielding the same results within the standard margin of error. The consistency across different testing methodologies eliminates the possibility of systematic equipment error. Feinstein continued to press on technical points about sample contamination and storage protocols, but each line of questioning was met with detailed explanations from Dr. Keller about the rigorous chain of custody and quality control measures used in the laboratory, effectively closing potential avenues for reasonable doubt about the foundational clue. The prosecution then called Dr. Eleanor Chang, the Baltimore City medical examiner, who had personally performed the autopsy on William Peterson and supervised the autopsies of his children. Dr. Chang provided detailed testimony about the physical evidence of zolpidem toxicity found in all 4 victims, including the characteristic pulmonary edema and brain swelling consistent with respiratory depression caused by sedative overdose. Using autopsy photographs and diagrams that had been carefully edited to maintain the dignity of the victims while illustrating the medical findings, Dr. Chang walked the jury through the timeline of death established by post-mortem indicators. Based on lividity patterns, body temperature, and gastric contents, she testified, all 4 victims died between approximately midnight and 2 a.m. on September 12, 2020, with William and Thomas dying in the Peterson home, while Michael and Sarah died in their respective residences after returning from the family dinner. Dr. Chang's most significant contribution to the prosecution's case came when she explained the absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle in any of the victims. All 4 individuals appear to have died peacefully in their sleep, unaware that they had been poisoned, she testified. This is consistent with zolpidem overdose, which would have initially induced sleep before gradually suppressing respiratory function to fatal levels. This testimony undermined the defense's suggestion that the victims might have knowingly taken the medication themselves, as the dosage levels found in their systems were far beyond what anyone would voluntarily consume and would have required the ingestion of dozens of pills, an implausible scenario given the absence of pill residue in the victims' digestive tracts and the bitter taste that would have been noticeable if not disguised in another substance. The scientific testimony establishing the foundational clue was followed by what many observers considered the most damning evidence against Emma Peterson. The testimony of Alexander Drake, her lover, and the man with whom she had planned to start a new life after eliminating her family. Drake, a 47-year-old attorney who had frequently appeared in Emma's courtroom before her retirement, entered the witness box with visible reluctance, his designer suit and carefully groomed appearance creating a stark contrast with Emma's now diminished presence at the defense table. As Drake was sworn in, Emma's composed facade briefly cracked, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened, the first significant emotional reaction she had displayed since the trial began. Drake testified about their affair, which had begun approximately 2 years before the murders during a bar association event and had quickly intensified into regular clandestine meetings at a harborfront hotel. Under Prosecutor Warren's careful questioning, Drake described how Emma's attitude toward her family had changed over the course of their relationship, evolving from occasional complaints about family obligations interfering with their time together to explicit statements about wishing to be free of her burdensome husband and adult children. At first, I thought it was just the normal venting that happens in any relationship, Drake testified, his voice low and tense as he avoided looking at Emma. But around 6 months before the murders, her language became more specific. She started talking about how her knowledge of pharmaceuticals could solve problems, and how her judicial connections would ensure that any investigation would be directed away from her. The prosecution introduced text messages between Emma and Drake that revealed the escalating nature of their conversations about eliminating her family. Messages sent 3 months before the murders included Emma writing, "I've been researching options that would look natural. No one questions when older men have heart attacks or when stressed adults take too many sleeping pills." Another message, sent just 2 weeks before the murders, stated, "After they're gone, we'll have everything we've talked about: the house in Portugal, financial freedom, and decades together without obligations to anyone else." Drake testified that he had responded to these messages with what he characterized as non-committal encouragement because he hadn't believed Emma would actually act on these statements, viewing them instead as dark fantasy or the venting of a frustrated spouse. When questioned about his own culpability, Drake admitted that he had researched properties in Portugal at Emma's request and had discussed how they would establish new identities there, but maintained that he had never explicitly encouraged or assisted in planning the murders. "I thought we were playing a game of what if," he claimed, his testimony reflecting a man trying to distance himself from moral, if not legal, responsibility. "I never believed she would actually harm her family. When I heard about their deaths, I was shocked and horrified." This portion of Drake's testimony created visible tension in the courtroom, with many observers, particularly the victims' friends and colleagues in attendance, clearly skeptical of his claimed ignorance, though prosecutors had determined the evidence insufficient to charge him as an accomplice. The most revealing aspect of Drake's testimony came when Prosecutor Warren asked him about Emma's behavior in the days immediately following the murders. "She called me the morning after it happened," Drake recalled, his voice now barely audible in the silent courtroom. "She said, 'It's done. Everything went according to plan. In a few weeks, after appropriate grieving, we can begin moving forward.'" She sounded calm, relieved even. This testimony provided the jury with insight into Emma's state of mind immediately after the murders, contradicting the defense narrative that she had been genuinely shocked and devastated by the deaths of her family members. Drake further testified that Emma had instructed him to continue their normal routine separately until sufficient time had passed to avoid suspicion, with plans to eventually present their relationship as having developed after her family's tragic deaths. Defense attorney Feinstein's cross-examination of Drake was aggressive, portraying him as an opportunistic romantic partner who had encouraged Emma's fantasies and was now attempting to save himself by placing all responsibility on her. "Mr. Drake, isn't it true that you stood to benefit financially from these deaths through your relationship with Ms. Peterson?" Feinstein asked, his tone suggesting Drake was equally culpable. "You were aware of the insurance policies, the valuable estate, and you had actively researched property in a country known for its limited extradition agreements with the United States. Yet you want this jury to believe you were an innocent bystander?" Drake's uncomfortable shifting in the witness chair during this questioning suggested Feinstein had struck a nerve, though Drake maintained that he had never believed Emma would act on what he characterized as dark venting about her family situation. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by the testimony of Dr. Rachel Gordon, a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed Emma's journals, text messages, internet search history, and financial records to construct a psychological profile explaining how a respected judge could commit such calculated familicide. Dr. Gordon explained the concept of compartmentalization, the psychological mechanism that allows individuals to separate contradictory aspects of their lives and maintain incompatible identities. In Ms. Peterson's case, we see classic compartmentalization between her public identity as a respected judge and her private desire to eliminate her family, Dr. Gordon testified. Her judicial training actually facilitated this division, as it taught her to separate emotion from decision-making and to view complex situations through a detached, analytical lens. This testimony helped the jury understand how someone who had dedicated her professional life to upholding justice could methodically plan and execute the murder of her own family, viewing them not as beloved individuals, but as obstacles to be removed through careful, logical steps. The prosecution concluded its presentation of key testimony with perhaps the most emotionally impactful witness, Robert Chen, Sarah Peterson's fiancé, who had discovered her body on the morning after the murders. Chen, a pediatric surgeon who had worked alongside Sarah at the University of Maryland Children's Hospital, provided heart-rending testimony about their relationship and future plans that had been destroyed by Emma Peterson's actions. "We were going to be married in the spring," Chen testified, his voice breaking as he described the home they had purchased together and their plans to eventually open a pediatric clinic in one of Baltimore's underserved neighborhoods. Sarah had just begun addressing wedding invitations the night before she died. The last text she sent me before going to bed was about how much she had enjoyed seeing her family at dinner and how lucky she felt to have such supportive parents for our future together. This testimony humanized the victims for the jury, transforming them from abstract figures in a scientific and legal case into real people with hopes, dreams, and futures that had been deliberately stolen by the defendant. The defense began its presentation of key testimony with Dr. Gregory Winters, a pharmacologist who attempted to challenge the prosecution's foundational clue by suggesting alternative explanations for the identical toxicology results. Dr. Winters proposed that if all 4 victims had voluntarily taken Ambien from the same prescription bottle within a similar time frame, and if the laboratory analysis had been conducted simultaneously using the same equipment calibration, the margin of error in testing might account for the seemingly identical readings. This testimony, however, was effectively undermined during cross-examination when Prosecutor Warren had Dr. Winters acknowledge that such a scenario would still require extraordinary coincidence and would not explain why all 4 victims would independently decide to take lethal doses of Emma's medication on the same night, particularly when 3 of them had no history of using sleep aids. The defense's strategy then shifted to presenting character witnesses who testified about Emma Peterson's reputation for integrity during her judicial career. Former colleagues from the Baltimore City Circuit Court described her as a fair and principled judge who had maintained the highest ethical standards in her professional life. Richard Harrington, the administrative judge who had supervised Emma before her retirement, testified, "In 20 years working alongside Judge Peterson, I never once saw her bend the rules or use her position for personal advantage. She was respected by prosecutors and defense attorneys alike for her commitment to proper procedure and ethical conduct." These character witnesses sought to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that someone with such a consistent record of ethical behavior throughout her career would be unlikely to suddenly commit such a calculated crime. The final key witness for the defense was Dr. Martin Feldman, a toxicologist who proposed that William Peterson might have obtained his wife's medication and administered it to himself and the children without Emma's knowledge. If William was experiencing severe stress from his new position and was concerned about his children's well-being, he might have decided that the family needed rest and relaxation, Dr. Feldman suggested, offering an alternative narrative that would explain the identical toxicology results while absolving Emma of responsibility. This testimony represented the defense's most direct attempt to provide an alternative explanation for the foundational clue, though it required the jury to accept a scenario in which a respected cardiologist would deliberately administer lethal doses of medication to his adult children without their knowledge or consent, a theory that many observers found even less plausible than the prosecution's case against Emma. As the key testimony phase of the trial concluded, the jury had heard detailed scientific evidence establishing the identical toxicology results as a statistical impossibility without deliberate poisoning, testimony from Emma's lover about her statements regarding removing obstacles and planning for life after her family's deaths, and psychological analysis explaining how her compartmentalization could allow her to maintain her judicial persona while planning familicide. The defense had attempted to create reasonable doubt through character witnesses and alternative theories about the toxicology results, but had struggled to provide a coherent explanation for the comprehensive evidence presented by the prosecution. The case would now move to closing arguments, with the jury faced with determining whether the former judge who had once sat in judgment of others would herself be judged guilty of the calculated murder of her husband and 3 children. On February 9, 2021, after 19 days of testimony, the trial of Emma Peterson moved into its final phase as both prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments to the jury. The Baltimore City Circuit Courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and throngs of spectators, some holding signs supporting justice for the Peterson family, while others protested Maryland's death penalty, which prosecutors had indicated they would seek if Emma was convicted. Inside Courtroom 400, every seat was filled as citizens from across Baltimore's diverse neighborhoods came to witness the culmination of a case that had captivated the city with its shocking betrayal of family and judicial trust. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense with anticipation as prosecutor Natalie Warren approached the jury box to deliver the state's final argument, her measured steps reflecting the methodical approach she had maintained throughout the trial. Warren began her closing argument by returning to the foundational clue that had launched the investigation: the identical levels of zolpidem found in all 4 victims. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, throughout this trial, you have heard extensive scientific testimony establishing that the identical toxicology results found in William, Michael, Sarah, and Thomas Peterson represent a pharmacological impossibility without deliberate calculated poisoning. Warren stated, her voice clear and deliberate. This single, irrefutable scientific fact forms the cornerstone of the state's case, and from this foundation, we have built a comprehensive narrative supported by physical evidence, digital records, financial transactions, and testimony about motive. Warren then methodically reviewed the evidence presented over the previous weeks, connecting the scientific proof of poisoning to Emma Peterson through her prescription records, the residue found in her kitchen, and the detailed planning document discovered on her computer. The prosecutor's most powerful moment came when she addressed the psychological dimension of the case, explaining how Emma Peterson's compartmentalization had allowed her to maintain her judicial persona while methodically planning the elimination of her family. The defendant spent decades separating emotion from decision-making, viewing complex situations through a detached analytical lens, Warren explained, directly referencing Dr. Gordon's expert testimony. This same psychological mechanism that made her an effective judge enabled her to view her husband and children not as beloved family members, but as obstacles to be removed through careful, logical steps. Warren then displayed a timeline showing the correlation between Emma's affair with Alexander Drake, her financial preparations, and the increasing specificity of her plans to eliminate her family, demonstrating the calculated progression from dissatisfaction to murder that had occurred over approximately 18 months. Warren concluded by addressing the defense's alternative theories directly, systematically dismantling each proposed explanation for the evidence. The defense asks you to believe that William Peterson, a respected cardiologist with no history of mental health issues, suddenly decided to poison himself and his 3 adult children without their knowledge or consent, she stated, her tone reflecting the implausibility of this scenario. They ask you to believe that the defendant's detailed murder plan was actually notes for a novel, that her secret bank account was routine financial planning, and that her research into countries without extradition treaties was professional curiosity. Ladies and gentlemen, the simple explanation, the one supported by all the evidence, is that Emma Peterson murdered her family to pursue a new life with her lover, using her judicial knowledge to plan and nearly escape accountability for these cold, calculated killings. With these words, Warren returned to her seat at the prosecution table, leaving the jury with a clear, coherent narrative that connected all the evidence presented during the trial. Defense attorney Howard Feinstein rose for his closing argument with the difficult task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of the prosecution's comprehensive case. Feinstein, a skilled advocate, known for his ability to connect with juries, approached his closing with a strategy focused on humanizing Emma Peterson and questioning the certainty of the scientific evidence. The prosecution has presented a narrative that asks you to believe that a woman who spent her entire career upholding the law, who was respected by all who worked with her for her integrity and ethical standards, suddenly transformed into a calculating killer, Feinstein began, his resonant voice filling the courtroom. They ask you to make this extraordinary leap based on circumstantial evidence and scientific conclusions that, as our expert testified, are subject to alternative explanations. Feinstein focused particularly on challenging the prosecution's foundational clue, suggesting that laboratory error, contamination of samples, or undiscovered natural factors might explain the identical toxicology results. Science is not infallible, he reminded the jury, referencing cases where seemingly conclusive forensic evidence had later been disproven. The prosecution's entire case rests on the assumption that these identical readings can only be explained by deliberate poisoning, but as Dr. Winters testified, there are other possible explanations that have not been conclusively eliminated. This approach sought to create doubt about the scientific cornerstone of the state's case, suggesting that if the foundational clue could be questioned, the entire narrative constructed upon it might collapse. The defense attorney also addressed the evidence of Emma's affair with Drake, her financial preparations, and her internet searches, presenting them as being taken out of context and given sinister interpretations by investigators determined to build a case against her. Many marriages experience difficulties. Many people fantasize about different lives, and many individuals research topics out of curiosity that might appear suspicious when viewed through the lens of a criminal investigation, Feinstein argued. None of these things prove murder. He reminded the jury that the burden of proof rested with the prosecution and urged them to consider whether the evidence truly eliminated all reasonable doubt about Emma's guilt, particularly given her lifetime of ethical conduct on the bench. As Feinstein concluded his argument, he made a direct emotional appeal to the jury, asking them to consider the extraordinary nature of a case, asking them to convict a former judge with no prior criminal history of murdering her entire family. The prosecution wants you to believe that Emma Peterson is a monster who could coldly plan and execute the murder of the people closest to her, he stated, gesturing toward his client, who sat with perfect posture at the defense table, her expression carefully controlled. But you have heard from colleagues who worked alongside her for decades, who testified to her character, her principles, and her commitment to justice. Is it reasonable to believe that such a person would commit these crimes? Or is it more reasonable to believe that there is another explanation for this tragedy, one that the investigation, focused solely on building a case against Emma Peterson, failed to discover? With this question hanging in the air, Feinstein returned to the defense table, having done his best to create doubt in the minds of the jurors. Prosecutor Warren delivered a brief but powerful rebuttal, reminding the jury that Emma Peterson's judicial experience had made her not less, but more dangerous. Someone who understood how to plan a crime, mislead investigators, and construct a defense based on procedural challenges rather than factual innocence. The defendant's knowledge of the law did not prevent her from committing these murders, Warren argued. Instead, it made her believe she could commit the perfect crime and escape justice. But the science cannot be deceived, the evidence cannot be intimidated, and the truth cannot be manipulated by judicial authority or legal expertise. With these words, the arguments concluded, and Judge Marcus Thompson provided his instructions to the jury, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the concept of reasonable doubt, and the process they should follow in their deliberations. The jury began deliberations at 2:17 p.m. on February 9th, retiring to a conference room where they would spend the next 6 hours weighing the evidence and arguments presented during the trial. Outside the courthouse, media representatives from national networks set up live broadcast positions along Calvert Street, while citizens gathered in small groups discussing the case that had forced Baltimore to confront the disturbing reality that those entrusted with upholding justice might themselves commit the most heinous crimes. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens representing Baltimore's diverse communities methodically reviewed the evidence, focusing particularly on the scientific testimony regarding the toxicology results and the correlation between Emma's digital, financial, and physical preparations for the murders. At 8:22 p.m., the jury notified the court that they had reached a verdict. Court officers contacted all parties to return to the courtroom, and Judge Thompson reconvened the proceedings at 9:05 p.m. Emma Peterson was brought back to the courtroom from the holding cell where she had waited during deliberations, her composure still intact, though observers noted increasing tension in her jaw and hands as she took her place at the defense table. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in, their faces solemn with the weight of the decision they had reached. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged high school teacher from northeast Baltimore, stood as the clerk asked whether they had reached a verdict, responding with a clear "We have" that echoed through the hushed room. Judge Thompson instructed Emma Peterson to stand as the verdict was read, and for the first time since the trial began, her judicial mask seemed to slip slightly, a barely perceptible tremor visible in her hands as she rose. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of William Peterson, we find the defendant, Emma Peterson, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom despite the judge's earlier admonition against displays of emotion. The clerk continued, "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Michael Peterson, we find the defendant, Emma Peterson, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Peterson, we find the defendant, Emma Peterson, guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Peterson, we find the defendant, Emma Peterson, guilty." As the fourth guilty verdict was announced, Emma Peterson's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, her face contorted in shock and disbelief, her legs giving way beneath her as she collapsed into her chair, the reality of her conviction seemingly breaking through the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed her to remain detached throughout the trial. For the first time, observers saw raw emotion from the former judge, not remorse for her family, but stunned incredulity that she, who had sentenced countless others, was now herself condemned by the justice system she had once administered. Defense attorney Feinstein placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as Judge Thompson thanked the jury for their service and scheduled the sentencing hearing for March 15, 2021. The reaction to the verdict rippled outward from the courtroom through Baltimore's interconnected communities, from the legal professionals who had worked alongside Emma Peterson to the neighborhoods where the Peterson family had been known for their charitable work. Robert Chen, Sarah Peterson's fiancé, embraced Prosecutor Warren outside the courtroom, tears streaming down his face as he expressed gratitude for the justice delivered for the woman he had planned to marry. Alexander Drake, who had been present for the verdict, though separated from the main courtroom audience, slipped away through a side entrance, pursued by reporters asking whether he felt morally responsible for the deaths, even though he had not been legally charged as an accomplice. Baltimore City State's Attorney Natalie Warren held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps, her words measured and free from triumphalism, as she acknowledged the tragic nature of the case while affirming that no one, regardless of position or power, stands above the law. As news of the verdict spread throughout Baltimore, citizens gathered in informal groups to discuss the case that had captivated the city for months. In the waterfront restaurants of Fells Point, legal professionals debated the strength of the prosecution's case and the potential grounds for appeal. In the working-class neighborhoods of East Baltimore, residents who had appeared before Judge Peterson during her time on the bench expressed satisfaction that the system had worked as intended, holding accountable even one of its own. At Johns Hopkins Hospital, colleagues of William and Sarah Peterson held a small, impromptu memorial gathering, celebrating the lives of the dedicated physicians whose work had touched countless patients throughout the city. The diverse reactions reflected Baltimore itself, a city of stark contrasts and divisions, yet united in its reckoning with a crime that had violated the most fundamental trust of family and professional responsibility. Emma Peterson was returned to the Baltimore City Detention Center to await sentencing, now housed in the protective custody unit reserved for high-profile inmates at risk in the general population. The former judge, who had sent many to similar facilities, now experienced the harsh reality of incarceration firsthand, confined to a small cell in the same system she had once viewed only from the elevated perspective of the bench. Court officers who had once stood when she entered a courtroom now monitored her through regular checks, while detainees who remembered appearing before her watched with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction as the former judge was processed into the jail population. The Baltimore legal community, still reeling from the conviction of one of their own, began the difficult process of examining what safeguards might have identified Emma Peterson's psychological deterioration before it culminated in the calculated murder of her family, a question that would continue to haunt the city's courtrooms long after the trial had concluded. On March 15, 2021, the Baltimore City Circuit Courthouse once again filled with spectators, media, and legal professionals for the sentencing hearing of Emma Peterson, the former judge now convicted of murdering her husband and 3 adult children. The sentencing phase had generated intense public discussion throughout Baltimore, with opinion divided on whether the death penalty, still legal in Maryland at the time of the crimes, should be applied to a former judicial officer who had herself sentenced many defendants during her career on the bench. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators representing both sides of the capital punishment debate held signs and chanted slogans, creating a backdrop of societal division that mirrored Baltimore's own contrasts between wealth and poverty, opportunity and struggle, justice and inequality. Inside courtroom 400, Now familiar to the public through weeks of trial coverage, Judge Marcus Thompson prepared to determine the punishment for a woman who had once been his colleague and peer in the Maryland judiciary. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements from those whose lives had been devastated by Emma Peterson's crimes. Robert Chen, who would have become Sarah Peterson's husband, spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face as he described the future that had been stolen from him. Sarah and I were planning not just a wedding, but a lifetime of service to the children of Baltimore through the clinic we hope to establish, Chen testified, holding a photograph of Sarah in her white medical coat. Her patients still ask for Dr. Sunshine, not understanding that the woman who made their treatments bearable through her kindness and compassion is gone forever because her own mother decided her life was an obstacle to personal happiness. Chen's testimony humanized Sarah beyond the clinical details of her death, reminding the court of the ongoing ripple effects of Emma's actions on patients, colleagues, and the community that had benefited from Sarah's medical expertise and compassionate care. Jessica Peterson, Michael's widow and mother of their twin daughters, provided perhaps the most heart-rending testimony as she described explaining to her 7-year-old children that their father had been murdered by their grandmother. How do you tell children that the person who should have loved and protected them instead deliberately ended their father's life? She asked, her voice breaking as she addressed the court. My daughters now struggle with nightmares, with trust, with the fundamental security that every child deserves. They cannot understand why their grandmother, who gave them birthday presents and read them stories, would take their daddy away forever. Jessica described Michael's dedication as a father despite his demanding career, the community development projects he had championed in Baltimore's struggling neighborhoods, and the financial literacy programs he had established for underprivileged youth, all now ended by his mother's calculated decision to eliminate him as part of her plan for a new life. James Wilson, Thomas Peterson's partner of 5 years, spoke of the architectural projects left unfinished and the community revitalization plans that would never be realized. Thomas believed in Baltimore's potential for renewal, Wilson testified, his architectural drawings displayed on the courtroom's evidence screen. He turned down prestigious offers in other cities because he was committed to using his talents to help this city balance preservation with progress, creating spaces that honored our history while serving current community needs. Wilson described how Thomas's sustainable urban design principles had been gaining recognition throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, with several of his adaptive reuse projects becoming models for similar initiatives in other post-industrial cities. His vision for transforming abandoned industrial spaces into affordable housing, community centers, and green spaces will never be fully realized because the person who should have taken the most pride in his accomplishments instead saw him as disposable. Dr. Marcus Winters, chief of cardiology at Johns Hopkins Hospital and William Peterson's colleague for over 30 years, provided testimony about the professional legacy lost through William's murder. In the months since we lost William, our cardiology department has struggled to fill the void left by his absence, Winters explained, describing the community outreach program that William had been developing to bring advanced cardiac care to underserved Baltimore neighborhoods. William never forgot his own roots in West Baltimore. Despite his success, he maintained a deep commitment to ensuring that quality medical care was available to all citizens, not just those with resources and connections. Winters detailed how William had mentored dozens of young physicians now practicing throughout Maryland, many of whom had chosen cardiology because of his influence, and who now carried his teaching methods and patient-centered approach into their own practices, an enduring legacy despite Emma's attempt to erase him from her life. Following the victim impact statements, Prosecutor Natalie Warren addressed the court regarding the state's recommendation for punishment. Your Honor, the state of Maryland requests that Emma Peterson be sentenced to death for each of the 4 counts of first-degree murder for which she has been convicted, Warren stated, her voice reflecting the solemnity of the recommendation. The defendant's crimes meet all statutory requirements for a capital punishment in our state. They were premeditated, committed with special cruelty through the betrayal of fundamental family trust, involved multiple victims, and were motivated by the defendant's desire for financial gain through insurance proceeds and inheritance. Warren acknowledged the ongoing debate about capital punishment, but argued that Emma Peterson's case represented precisely the type of calculated, cold-blooded murder for which the death penalty had been maintained in Maryland law. Warren's most compelling argument centered on Emma Peterson's abuse of her judicial knowledge and position in planning and attempting to conceal the murders. The defendant used her understanding of investigative procedures, evidence collection, and legal defenses to plan what she believed would be the perfect crime, Warren argued. She exploited her judicial authority to obtain the medication used to kill her family, attempted to use her connections to influence the initial investigation, and believed that her status would shield her from the consequences that she had imposed on countless defendants during her career on the bench. This extraordinary breach of public trust and perversion of judicial knowledge for murderous purposes warrants the ultimate punishment available under Maryland law. The prosecutor concluded by reminding the court that Emma Peterson had shown no remorse throughout the trial, maintaining instead the composed, calculating demeanor that had characterized both her judicial career and her approach to eliminating her family. Defense attorney Howard Feinstein presented arguments against the death penalty, focusing on Emma Peterson's prior contributions to the Maryland justice system and the absence of any criminal history before these offenses. Despite the jury's verdict, which we respect while preparing our appeal, we ask the court to consider Ms. Peterson's 2 decades of public service, during which she upheld the law and contributed significantly to jurisprudence in our state, Feinstein argued. Her career included establishing specialized drug courts that emphasized rehabilitation over incarceration, advocating for improved mental health services within the correctional system, and mentoring dozens of young attorneys who continue to serve our community. Feinstein suggested that a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would appropriately protect society while acknowledging the positive aspects of Emma's earlier life before whatever psychological deterioration had led to her crimes. Feinstein also presented testimony from Dr. Leonard Goldstein, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Emma Peterson following her conviction. Dr. Goldstein testified about the severe compartmentalization and narcissistic personality traits that had enabled Emma to maintain her judicial persona while planning familicide, suggesting that these psychological factors, while not rising to the level of legal insanity, represented a form of mental disturbance that should be considered mitigating in the sentencing decision. Ms. Peterson's psychological evaluation reveals an individual who had become increasingly detached from normal emotional connections, viewing her family members as extensions of herself rather than as autonomous individuals with inherent value, Dr. Goldstein explained. This severe narcissistic disturbance, combined with her judicial training in analytical decision-making, created a perfect storm that allowed her to plan these acts while remaining disconnected from their moral implications. After all arguments had been presented, Judge Thompson offered Emma Peterson the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. For the first time since her arrest, the former judge spoke publicly about the crimes for which she had been convicted. Rising slowly from the defense table, Emma faced the judge who had once been her colleague, her voice initially steady but growing more strained as she proceeded. "Your Honor, I stand before this court in a position I never imagined occupying," she began. the irony of her situation evident to everyone in the courtroom. I have spent my life interpreting and applying the law, believing in the principles of justice that form the foundation of our system. I maintain my innocence of these charges and look forward to the appeal process that will, I believe, vindicate me. Emma's statement, rather than expressing remorse for her family's deaths or acknowledging the pain expressed in the victim impact statements, focused instead on procedural complaints about her trial and suggestions that evidence had been misinterpreted. The scientific conclusions presented to the jury failed to account for alternative explanations that would have exonerated me, she claimed, her tone reminiscent of her days on the bench when critiquing attorneys' arguments. The financial transactions characterized as preparations for flight were routine retirement planning. The relationship with Mr. Drake was inappropriate, but not evidence of murderous intent. This statement, focusing on technical challenges rather than emotional content, reinforced the psychological profile presented by experts during the trial. A woman so compartmentalized that even facing severe punishment, she remained unable to connect emotionally with the devastating impact of her actions on the victims and survivors. Judge Marcus Thompson, who had maintained a strictly neutral demeanor throughout the trial despite his prior professional relationship with the defendant, delivered his sentencing decision with the measured tone that characterized his judicial reputation. The jury in this case has convicted Emma Peterson of 4 counts of first-degree murder, finding beyond reasonable doubt that she deliberately and with premeditation caused the deaths of her husband and 3 children through poisoning, Thompson began, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. Having considered the evidence presented at trial, the victim impact statements, the arguments regarding sentencing, and the defendant's own statement, I must now determine the appropriate punishment under Maryland law. Judge Thompson addressed the unique aspects of the case, acknowledging the defendant's judicial background and its implications for sentencing. This court cannot ignore that the defendant used knowledge gained through years of judicial service to plan these murders and attempt to evade justice, he stated. The breach of trust represented by these crimes is twofold: the fundamental trust between family members and the public trust placed in those who administer justice. Both have been violated in the most profound way possible. Thompson noted that in his 25 years on the bench, he had never encountered a case that more clearly met the statutory requirements for capital punishment, with multiple aggravating factors and minimal mitigating circumstances. Therefore, it is the judgment and sentence of this court that Emma Peterson, having been convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, shall be sentenced to death for each count, with the sentences to be carried out as prescribed by Maryland law. The pronouncement of the death sentence created an audible reaction throughout the courtroom, despite the judge's earlier admonition against displays of emotion. Emma Peterson, who had maintained her composed facade throughout most of the proceedings, visibly paled at the sentence, gripping the defense table for support as the full reality of her punishment appeared to register. Judge Thompson concluded the proceedings by reminding those present that all death sentences in Maryland were subject to automatic appeal, a process that would likely take years to complete, given the complexity of the case and the defendant's resources for legal representation. Emma Peterson was immediately taken into custody by corrections officers to begin her transfer to the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup, where she would be held on death row pending the outcome of her appeals. As she was led from the courtroom, the former judge who had sentenced many to similar fates during her career walked with the straight posture and measured steps that had characterized her judicial bearing, though observers noted that her hands, now shackled at her waist, trembled visibly, perhaps the only outward sign of the emotion she otherwise continued to compartmentalize. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind her, symbolically separating Emma Peterson from the legal profession she had served and the society whose fundamental trust she had violated through her calculated elimination of her family. The sentencing of Emma Peterson generated intense discussion throughout Baltimore and beyond, with legal commentators, ethics experts, and criminal justice advocates debating the implications of a former judge receiving the death penalty. Baltimore's diverse communities, from the wealthy enclaves of Roland Park to the working-class neighborhoods of Highlandtown, processed the conclusion of the case in ways that reflected their differing relationships with the justice system. For citizens who had appeared before Judge Peterson during her time on the bench, many expressed a complex mixture of vindication that the system had worked as intended and disturbing realization that the judge who had determined their fates had harbored such darkness within herself. The contrast between Emma's public persona of judicial integrity and the calculated killer revealed during the trial forced a broader reckoning with questions of character, compartmentalization, and the limits of professional vetting in positions of authority. The Peterson case prompted significant reforms within Maryland's judicial oversight system, with new psychological screening protocols implemented for judicial candidates and sitting judges. The Maryland Judicial Ethics Committee established enhanced disclosure requirements regarding personal relationships that might create conflicts of interest, and mandatory periodic psychological evaluations were instituted for judges handling criminal matters. These reforms, directly inspired by Emma Peterson's ability to maintain her judicial persona while planning familicide, represented an attempt to prevent similar situations in the future by identifying psychological deterioration before it manifested in criminal behavior. Baltimore's legal community, deeply shaken by having one of their own revealed as a calculated killer, embraced these reforms as necessary safeguards for public trust in the judiciary. The legacy of the Peterson family continued through initiatives established in their memory, transforming the tragedy of their deaths into ongoing community benefits that honored their individual contributions to Baltimore. The William Peterson Community Cardiology Program was launched at Johns Hopkins Hospital, bringing advanced cardiac care to underserved neighborhoods throughout the city, continuing the outreach work he had planned before his murder. The Sarah Peterson Pediatric Clinic opened in East Baltimore, established by Robert Chen in memory of his fiancée, providing comprehensive health care to children regardless of their family's ability to pay. The Michael Peterson Financial Literacy Foundation expanded its programs to schools throughout Maryland, teaching young people the financial skills he had championed during his life, while the Thomas Peterson Sustainable Design Scholarship supported architecture students committed to community-centered urban renewal projects. These positive legacies stood in stark contrast to Emma Peterson's imprisonment at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women, where the former judge experienced the harsh reality of the system she had once administered from the bench. Corrections officers who had testified in cases before her now supervised her daily activities, while fellow inmates, many of whom had been sentenced by judges influenced by Emma's judicial philosophy, observed with complex emotions the fall of someone who had once held such authority. Emma's appeals process began immediately, with her legal team challenging various aspects of the trial, including the scientific testimony regarding the toxicology results, the admissibility of digital evidence, and the death sentence itself as potentially unconstitutional. Legal experts predicted the appeals would continue for years, possibly decades, creating a prolonged epilogue to a case that had already forced Baltimore to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, psychology, and the human capacity for compartmentalization. 5 years after the murders, as Emma Peterson's appeals continued to work through the court system, Baltimore had largely moved forward while carrying the lessons of the case into its institutional practices and collective memory. The courthouse where she had presided now featured a memorial plaque honoring the Peterson family, a reminder to all who administered justice there of the sacred trust placed in their hands and the devastating consequences when that trust is betrayed. For the citizens of Baltimore, from the harbor to the city's outer neighborhoods, the case remained a powerful reminder that justice ultimately applies to all, even those who once sat in judgment of others, and that beneath the most respectable exteriors may lurk capacities for calculation and cruelty that emerge only when fundamental human connections have been severed by narcissism, entitlement, and the cold rationalization of family as obstacles rather than beloved individuals deserving of life and happiness. The final legacy of the Peterson case existed in the ongoing question it posed to Baltimore's judicial system and to society more broadly. How can we identify those whose compartmentalization allows them to maintain respectable public personas while harboring destructive private intentions? This question, with no simple answer, continued to influence training, oversight, and ethical discussions within the legal profession and beyond, ensuring that the tragedy of the Peterson family would not be forgotten, but would instead contribute to a more vigilant, psychologically informed approach to those entrusted with administering justice. For a city accustomed to navigating stark contrasts between wealth and poverty, opportunity and struggle, the Peterson case added another dimension to Baltimore's complex identity, a reminder that the pursuit of justice requires eternal vigilance, even against threats that emerge from within the very system designed to protect society's most fundamental values and relationships.